All right, so I've hit record. Folks are here. Welcome, everybody. It is 1 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Peter Loge. I'm the director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication at the George Washington University. I'm thrilled to be joined by a special guest today we're going to get to in a moment. Some logistics up front. First of all, this is being recorded. I'll send a link to the recording to everyone who registered for the event, and I'll put it on the website, so it'll live in memoriam. Share it with your friends. That also means that what we raise today is going to be in memoriam. So let's be a little bit careful, or intentionally disruptive, not accidentally disruptive. The Project on Ethics and Political Communication, as most of you know who are watching this, is here at GW, and we promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. The question on the table for the project is, what ethical responsibility, if any, do people in politics and political communication have, and to whom or what do they have it? We do this through being quoted in the press, through writing, through speaking, both virtually and in person on campuses or consulting firms, or pretty much anybody who will listen to us. And of course, occasionally with a video conversation series like this one, which leads me to somebody I am thrilled to welcome, a fellow New Englander, temporarily relocated to Colorado, but hopefully your heart is still in Rhode Island. Claudine Schneider, former US Representative from the great state of Rhode Island, Republican representative for a decade, lifelong public servant. She describes herself not as a politician, but as a public servant. Since leaving office, and actually, indeed, while still in office before it was fashionable, was a leader on climate, on environment, and really addressing the crises that we now see ourselves faced with climate change. She's earned many awards and accolades, an honorary degree. She's earned an Emmy Award. She regularly speaks around the country. She's briefed world leaders. Just a really interesting, thoughtful person who believes deeply in both American politics and in making American politics better. So I'm done throat clearing and killing time. Welcome. Tell the people, who are you, what are you up to, and how did you get to a point where you're sitting on a Zoom with a guy in an academic office in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I won't go that far, Peter, but I will tell my origin story because I think that it is relevant to today's discussion. And I think that one of the most important things I want to leave you with, I'll start with, and that is knowing what your purpose is. And too many people are on their deathbed before they suddenly assess, well, what was my purpose? And I had a fantastic opportunity when I was 25 years old, when the doctors told me I had a 50-50 chance of dying because I had cancer of the lymph system. And what was immediately important to me is to think, what is my purpose? At age 25, I hadn't quite thought about that. And my parents had always said, we're all on this earth for a purpose. And so I just kept asking, help me to find the way. And the next thing I know, my husband at the time said, I think you should run for Congress. And I just laughed. And then it was two other people that I hardly knew said the same thing. And I thought, okay, I'm hearing this 3 times. Is this really what I'm supposed to do? Well, I concluded that since the incumbent had an 80% approval rating, and since most of the Democrats in Rhode Island at that time were very corrupt, we had concluded that we would register as Republicans. And the registration was 15 Democrats to every 1 Republican. So I concluded that my purpose was not necessarily to be, a congresswoman, but to be a messenger. And my message would be twofold. One, I would run a clean campaign, unlike folks had seen in the state before. And secondly, I would talk about issues that are rarely discussed. And that meant connecting the dots with the environment, because people were dumping waste in Narragansett Bay. Industry was not understanding that that's the reason that the bay was closed to shellfishing, which also was is an important industry to Rhode Island. And then at the time, Rhode Island was the 3rd highest with the cancer death rate in the nation. So connecting the dots, being a messenger, that's what I decided my purpose was. Of course, when I called my parents to tell them what I was doing, and they knew that I was recovering, from cancer, my dad's reaction was to his, little daughter, what on earth do you want to get mixed up with all those crooks and bums for? And so I said, Daddy, you always told me you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I think I need to be part of the problem. So that was my beginnings in the political arena, despite all odds.
That is fantastic. I think you just had hopefully an unintentional malapropism. You said you wanted to be part of the problem, and hopefully you actually meant part of the solution. Hopefully, hopefully. The so
Oh boy.
you raised two interesting points though. One is that your dad said, why would you want to be part of those crooks and bums? So crooks and bums is not a new thing, right? You were elected to office in the 1980s. And you and I didn't quite overlap. You left office as my first boss is getting elected. So it's easy for us to be nostalgic and say it used to be great when, right? It
Yeah.
didn't always used to be this bad. Is it worse now than it was when you were a member of the House of Representatives?
100% worse. And you can see this in a variety of ways. When we went, I mean, as members of Congress, we dressed respectfully. And, granted, my family was in the clothing business, and they always said you can't judge a book by its cover, but the cover is important, and to show respect to others and to yourself. And in addition to that, the number of lies that are being perpetrated from Congress and elsewhere in the political arena is so painful to me. It was never like that. Men and women were honest in Congress, but yet they had differing points of view. But the degree to which the lying is taking place now and being exacerbated, unfortunately, by the social media, is really problematic. So we have a huge challenge on our hands. And it's incumbent upon each of the individuals on this particular webinar to understand that they have an opportunity and a responsibility to be part of the solution also.
You raised two really good points. One is I think the context is important. Politics has never been, puppies and rainbows, but it is measurably worse now. Bill Madway with Better Angels, a terrific organization, asked when he registered for the event, asked what has to change to decrease the rancor? How do we get back to where we were when you were serving the House?
Once again, it depends on the candidate themselves. I had a political advisor coming from the Republican National Party to Rhode Island, suggesting that I do one thing or another. And I knew one thing that he was mentioning was a lie. And I told my team, I'm not going to do that. And they said, well, and the advisor said, you're going to lose otherwise. And my attitude was, I'd rather lose than tell a lie. And I think that this is what we need from our current candidates, as well as those who are involved in the campaigns. Campaign advisors must urge their, clients to speak the truth.
Well, I mean, I think broadly everybody would agree with you, right? Lying bad, telling the truth good. But as you said you would rather lose honorably than win dishonorably. But
Yes,
if I'm on the other side of that, I could make the argument that, well, if I don't win, then I can't vote for the things that are important. So I have to
right.
cheat a little bit now, right, to get bigger things later. In philosophy, that's often called the dirty hands problem, right? How dirty do you get your hands? So what incentive do you have to do the right thing beyond it's good to be honorable? And what do you do if you're in a bind? Like if I don't do this little bad thing, a lot worse things are going to happen down the line.
So there are two dynamics that move people. Someone running for office wants to move the voters toward them. Those two dynamics are pleasure and pain. And you see that in the advertising world. Drive this really slick car, you'll get, all the women or whatever, and or men. And or the pain part is if you don't purchase this, you'll be a loser. Or, so we have seen with the advent of Trump, and granted, there was some of this beforehand, but he has the megaphone now, as do his followers, and they are using fear. So, what would I use, for example, if I'm talking about climate change? I should not be overly didactic, but I should ask questions. What's going to happen to the farmers if this drought continues? Their crops all die. The price of your corn is going to go through the roof, or the price of your bread, And so help people understand with a little bit of fear, but without lying.
So,
It is possible to do how you frame your message.
you know, you're really driving home a point that so many of us try to drive home to candidates. You got to talk to voters where they are about what they care about, not what you care about. Farmers care about crops. Another idea that Denise Stoneback, who registered for this, raised, she started Citizens for Ethical Campaigns, interesting organization doing terrific work, talks about ethics pledges. Um, the what are the if a candidate signs an ethics pledge, they then get to highlight that in their campaign material. They get to run as an ethical candidate. What's your take on those pledges, and are they good or bad, or what do you think?
Well, I have a little bit of experience because after I left Congress, I was so frustrated that people did not know much at all about how incumbents voted. And so a number of us started what is called votesmart.org. And votesmart.org, a bipartisan effort, um, really did clarify for folks, what is the truth of the matter? And I'm sorry, that's not the point I wanted to make. Could you repeat that question one more
Well, what
time?
do you? Votesmart.org is terrific. Thank you for raising that.
Oh, signing the pledge.
Signing the pledge. So, what do you think about the pledges?
I think the pledges are a great idea, but what we found with Vote Smart is that candidates were not willing to even sign the pledge that they would answer the information honestly. So then we had to go to, gov.org and have volunteers check out the votes and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, it is. I think signing a pledge is a good idea. It's hard work. Not everybody will want to sign it. We found, you know, over time, the Republicans were less inclined to sign it than the Democrats, but even Democrats were not enthused about signing it.
Could you use it as a campaign issue? Could you say, look, Representative, candidate Loge here won't sign the pledge. He's unethical. Representative Schneider should go back to Congress because she has signed the pledge.
Yes, I think you could use it as a, differentiator.
Would it work?
Well, you'd have to ask the voters that question. It would with me, I wonder, well, wait a minute, what is this pledge and why won't this candidate sign it? And so it might prompt some questions, which I think prompting questions is a very good idea.
A couple times now you've highlighted that, right? You got to get citizens to prompt questions. You want to get people to ask more questions. You want to engage farmers in agriculture, watermen in the fishing industry, engaging them. So is part of the solution to ethics just engaging more voters?
I think the most important thing that any candidate can be doing today, and this is still August, is out there speaking to the Rotary clubs, to a whole broad spectrum of different organizations, so they just don't appear suddenly in a TV ad or on social media, but you've actually had that face to face. And there's an organization called the state's project, which focuses strictly on the state legislature, and they provide an incentive for their candidates to do door knocking, which I think is terrific. So if the candidate will do a certain number of door knockings, they will receive more money from the state's project, which I think, sometimes you have to give an incentive like that.
That's fantastic. I will check it out, and if I find it, I'll email it around to everybody who signed up for this talk. That's a great ad, a great addition. The other side of this, of course, is candidates. And Jeff Harris, one of my oldest friends, spent a career working with high school kids, trying to get them involved in politics and engaged. He's fully committed to the project you're engaged in and the institutions to which you and I have devoted our careers. He asks, though, what is preventing our best and our brightest from running for office?
I think there are two things. One is the nastiness of it. So if Peter and all of those listening could solve this one problem of being more ethical, more responsible in your communications in campaigns, that would be one critically important step. And the second thing is the money. There is no question but that the cost of some of these campaigns is ridiculous. And I often think of all of the hungry people in this world or in just in our own country that could benefit from those millions of dollars in order to, attain a seat in power. Um, and speaking of that, I want to mention one other thing. You said thanks for doing the ad for the state's project. Well, I also am doing some advertising for this book over my shoulder, which was written by a friend of mine, not my own book. It's The Leadership We Need, and it delineates the kind of leadership that each of us should be involved in this moment. Not necessarily if you're running for office, but your friend Peter, the high school teacher, because providing ethical leadership is probably one of the most important functions that we have today. And I happen to think that there are rewards for telling the truth. And I'll give a quick example. When I first got elected, I gathered my staff who just magically came to me. Happily, we all shared the same values, the same ethic, and we were enthused. And I said, look, the media thinks that my election was a fluke. I am the first woman ever elected to a major political office. I'm a Republican from a Democratic state. I had no money, no constituency. And so they just thought, she'll never last. They'll eat her alive. And I said, I also am dealing with this cancer thing hanging over my head. So I may be here for only 2 years. So we're going to maximize our opportunity. Well, the first opportunity that came up was President Reagan's budget. Well, I divvied it up among my staff. I happily had a chief of staff who had been a lawyer in the Navy, and he got the defense piece. And oh, Peter, you make that face, but I always hire people smarter than me. So
No, I think it was great. That was, as a former chief of staff, I was thinking, wow, I wasn't that qualified when I was a chief. That was a great hire.
but others, so at any rate, I divided it up. We all read it the night before I had to vote. We came in, I said, all right, what do you all think? And we concluded, I can't vote for this president's budget. Well, little did I know that's a pro forma budget. It doesn't mean a whole lot. It's just showing allegiance to the man who, or the president who is of your party. But I thought, I can't vote for it. I just can't. So I voted against it. And we had a very large class of Republicans that were elected that rode in on Reagan's coattails. I did not. Rhode Island voted for Jimmy Carter. So they switched their vote. And what happened was my colleague said, "Oh boy, you're in trouble now. You're going to lose out." Well, hey, so be it. The president did call me to the White House. He said, "Why did you vote against my budget?" Fortunately, I had been briefed so well by my team that I said, "Look, Mr. President, you had asked for 9 F-18s and the Joint Chiefs of Staff only wanted 3. And you're taking the money out of the Environmental Protection Agency and moving in." So I had a whole mental laundry list that I shared with him, and he listened. And what was interesting, when I came back, my colleague said, "What happened? What happened? Did he, rake you over the coals?" And I said, "No, he was very friendly." Well, 2 outcomes from speaking truth to power. One is my colleagues would then come up to me and say, "How are you going to vote on this one? How are you going to vote on that one?" Because they didn't want to stand alone. They wanted the company, and they knew that I was going to do what I thought was right. So the moral of that story is they wanted the comfort of a group of folks, and we ended up being 29 moderate Republicans. We didn't care if the bill was introduced by a Republican or a Democrat. Of course, in those days, they were usually bipartisan introduction of bills. But we decided one question: what's in the best interest of all the people? And we would vote for it. And we were the swing vote. So we were courted by the Democrats, we were courted by the Republicans. And despite that, we just thought, okay, this is the right thing to do. And I loved my colleagues because that's what we did. But the other outcome of that was that the president saw that I was pulling together all of these moderate Republicans, and James Baker came to me and said, "Could you help us on the tax bill? Because you could bring in the New Englanders and, the Republicans and the Democrats." And then Reagan had invited me to a briefing by the military, and I'm sitting there beside Dick Cheney and other members of the leadership, the little freshman woman, which was pretty unusual. But interestingly enough, after watching and listening to the military presentation, they expected me to be on board. And I had said to the president, if I agree with you, I will work hard to support you. But if I disagree with you, I will disagree with you. Well, what came out of that in listening to those military briefings, this was the time of the Soviet Union, was that I was pained, thinking, here I am in a position of power. I have to do something because I'm afraid we're on the brink of World War III. So long story short, not so short, what I did with a colleague was to organize a live and unedited conversation between members of Congress and members of the Supreme Soviet. And ABC agreed to carry it. We wanted to do it live and unedited. And they said, "Great, we'll have Ted Koppel." We said, no, he's too confrontational. I want Peter Jennings. So Peter Jennings and I worked out, we had 5 different programs that played on the Nightline segment. And it was live and unedited because in the Soviet Union at the time, they only had government media. So, we won an Emmy because they felt that we helped bring down the end the Cold War. So all of that is to say, there is value in speaking truth to power. And this morning I see that the Black woman, and I emphasize Black, because I am getting very tired of women and Blacks and minorities being attacked. But the woman from the Fed says, "No, I'm going to sue and I'm going to keep my position." And the woman from the CDC said, "No, I'm not quitting." Well, it's time to speak truth to power, to stand up for what you believe in. And I think that it's not an accident that those 2 recent folks happen to be women. No
there's
second
there's so
here.
there there's so much in there. As a political guy, I love that, back when Baker was chief of staff and Cheney was just a staffer, and the politics I grew up with. You said a couple of things, though, I think that are worth highlighting. One is the importance of knowing what you stand for before you have to stand for it. You
Oh,
didn't enter politics because you wanted to enter politics. You enter politics because you had a set of beliefs and values, and friends and neighbors said, you know what, you can help, right? You can bring your skill set, your beliefs and values to this situation. And your goal was to advance what you believed in, not to hold power or be a representative, right? You get the cool little pin you get to wear in your lapel. That's not the reason to run for Congress. The second, though, is also the importance of building coalition and then knowing how to use power, right? You didn't stand and shout alone. You pulled together a group of people, or they came to you and said, we've got half a dozen or a dozen members. We can swing this. How do we do this together? So it's also, how do you strategically exercise power? So it's not just shouting for what you believe in, but it's
yes,
finding a way to advance things you believe in a coalition that has actually the power to change the outcome. And that's values based, but it's also super strategic.
yes. Okay. First of all, dear men on this webinar, understand I love men, but I am going to share with you an experience I had when I first got to Congress. There were three other women that were elected that were Republicans at the same time, so four of us. And I knew what my beliefs were, what I wanted to focus on. And so I asked each one of them, we were all together one afternoon, and Marge Rockema from New Jersey, I said, Marge, why did you decide to run for Congress? She said, oh, I had kids in school. I was really upset with where the education was going. We need more federal leadership in doing testing and blah, blah, blah. The other woman, California, she said, we really need mass transit. This is something that I feel the federal government should be engaged in, blah, blah, blah. And the other woman, I don't recall exactly what she said, but I thought, that's interesting. Each of these women had some problem they wanted to solve, and that's why they ran for Congress. And so then I thought, well, I'm going to ask some of the guys. So I did. And the first guy said, well, I ran for class president when I was in college, senior class president, and I won. And I thought, this is pretty cool. Maybe I'll run for town council and maybe I'll run for mayor. And somebody else said, yeah, my dad was in politics and we would go with him handing out flyers and everything. And I thought it was pretty neat. And I thought, well, maybe I'd like to be in Congress someday too, or maybe the Senate, or maybe run for president. And I thought, well, this is interesting because all the answers I got from the men had to do with furthering their personal career or their ego or power. Women were eager to solve a problem. So I don't want to, belabor that too much, but the other thing that my friend here does, mention in the book about leadership and how it's different. Men feel they have to just say, this is where we're going, and they rely on communication primarily. Women, on the other hand, communicate with a team of people. They are the coalition builders. They feel that all of us together are better than one of us alone. So building the coalition is a strategic move to expand your power. And I am a huge coalition builder and feel that it is absolutely critical in this next election.
Your timing is perfect, which is unsurprising given your career in politics and in media and leadership. That we've reached the half an hour point, and you brought us back to where we started, which is the reason to be in politics is because you believe in being a public servant. And you've told me repeatedly that you're not a politician, in spite of the fact that you spent 10 years wandering the halls of Longworth, Cannon, and Rayburn. But you're a public servant. And one of the ways that manifests is in serving as an elected official from Rhode Island. One of the ways is advising taxpayers for common sense. One of the ways is bringing people together in communities. One of the ways is advocating for climate. It's about believing in something and finding ways to advance that belief rather than identifying a prize or a title and working backwards from that. And I think if, that can be part of a core of any ethical conversation is what do you believe in? How do we make that happen? And that might be elected office. It might be a staffer. It might be a teacher. Who knows what it is, but that's what's important. Our half an hour is up. Thank you so much. I don't think, unless you've worked in Congress, you don't understand how terrible a job it can be and what a grind it can be. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for representing a neighboring state of my home state. Thanks for joining us today and for all the work you're doing. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll email this around and we will see everybody next time. Thanks everybody.